Kia Roberts, thank you for joining me for this conversation about how to address race grievances in a different way. So glad to be able to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me again, Valerie. I really appreciate it.
It was, I think about when you and I first exchanged emails, you reached out to me because your clients were looking for someone to do diversity work and you were trying to help your clients find a strategic partner. At the time, my cup was overflowing, so I wasn't able to help, but I was pretty intrigued by you and what you did. And I held on to your information because it made me think of this thing that's just been burning with me so long, and that is race grievances. So let's start by telling people a little bit about what you do, because it's the thing that first attracted me to you and your business. So, what is Triangle Investigations?
So, Triangle Investigations is a group of lawyers and expert investigators conducting misconduct investigations within workplaces, schools, and other organizations. So, when I say misconduct, think sexual harassment, discrimination, retaliation. And we also do some sexual assault and abuse investigations, but that's more on college campuses and within private schools. We offer our clients usage of our proprietary Tele app, which is available on Google Play and the App Store. And that is an app that we give out to organization members, and it works as a reporting mechanism for people to report misconduct within their organization. So they go on to the Tele app, they make a report about misconduct, and the assurance that we give our clients is that within 24 hours of having received the submission, we've made contact with the reporting party. Within 72 hours of having received the submission, we provide the client with an investigative roadmap of the investigation, the contours of the investigation that we're about to perform, and then we perform the investigation.
So this was, you've already touched on the first thing that I thought was really creative and inventive and innovative, and that is Tele. So you created Tele. How did that come about?
So that's an interesting question. So the idea from Tele came around because I really try to keep my finger on the pulse of developments in the law as it relates to employer liability for misconduct within the workplace. So over the last several years, there's been a lot of legislation in various states, including in New York State, that really increases the employer's level of liability for misconduct in the workplace, whether they knew about it or not, which is such a weird, like, kind of thought to wrap your mind around, So it's not just that, employers that engage in cover-ups are getting hammered in court. The standard is so high now that employers literally have to have eyes and ears everywhere at all times and have really unique and innovative mechanisms available for people to report misconduct. So that's where the idea came from.
And they're liable for the misconduct, even if they were not aware of the misconduct.
That's correct. So from a risk management perspective, our clients love Tele because let's say we get 2-3 years down the road and someone files a lawsuit saying I was being discriminated against or I was being sexually harassed or otherwise mistreated. The employer is now in a position where they can say, we had this app that all the employees had, and they could have made a complaint 24 hours a day. We introduced Kia and her team to all of our staff. We have gone above and beyond what we can do in terms of being good actors and good citizens and doing what we can to create cohesive and inclusive workplaces.
It's almost like it's a defense that companies can use in defending themselves.
Absolutely. So that's kind of the risk management component of Tele. But then additionally, it helps to do good work because it helps to sniff out pain points within an organization so that they can be strategically addressed and fixed.
Right. So before we go on, tell folks a little bit more about you and your background. You worked in the Brooklyn DA's office for the NFL. Talk to folks a little bit about your background in doing this work.
Got it. So prior to founding Triangle, I was the first ever director of investigations for the NFL. So within that job, I did investigations into NFL players and employees accused of violating the NFL's code of conduct. So that was everything from workplace bullying and sexual harassment, all the way to the really, really high profile player incidents involving allegations of domestic violence, sexual assault, animal abuse, and child abuse. Prior to the NFL, I spent about a decade as a prosecutor here in the district attorney's office in Brooklyn, New York. I finished my time there as a homicide prosecutor doing murder cases.
And that's a pretty elite team. It's hard to get on that
Yes,
team.
that's the top 12 trial attorneys in an office of over 600 attorneys. And I was appointed there by the elected district attorney himself. Prior to the DA's office, I got my law degree at Vanderbilt. I got my undergraduate degree at Duke. I grew up in New Orleans and I live in Brooklyn with my husband and our 6-year-old and 2-year-old. So that's all about me.
Yeah, this is all that I made a commitment to learning about you after I got that first email. And so I'm thrilled to introduce you to the people who listen to me and all the things that I'm curious about. So now let's come to um, the unfortunate and callous killing of George Floyd and the racial uprising that happened after that. You know, what did that do for race discrimination cases, grievances, your business? Bring us forward a little bit and tell us what's
Right. So
happening
it was a
there.
very interesting summer in terms of what our clients were requesting of us and still are requesting of us, because I think that there's been this realization that, although major organizations have a really robust D&I department or a D&I officer or these really interesting initiatives, it really laid bare that there are so many pain points for employees of color within all organizations, with an emphasis kind of on corporate Fortune 500 kind of organizations. So I think it's forced a lot of organizations to do a lot of soul searching as to what their process and method has been for uncovering difficult pain points for their Black employees and their employees of color. So one of our relatively new offerings that came about this summer, because our clients are really clamoring for it, is that we help organizations create an end-to-end accountability structure. So that is, we're helping you write policies that really speak to issues within your specific organization. We're talking to employees and figuring out what are trending areas for misconduct and just general issues. And then we're helping build out your whole investigative process and how that flows, so that it's done in a consistent fashion.
So, Kia, we've talked about this a little bit, this concept of misconduct. And when it's overt, we know it, but sometimes misconduct in one organization is not necessarily misconduct in another. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So that's a really interesting phenomena that has to really acknowledge how different workplaces have different cultures, different trending issues, different hotspots. So when we first start engaging with our clients, some of the work that we do when we're helping with this accountability structure process is really defining what misconduct is and what it isn't in really articulated, detailed terms. So within our organization, this list of behavior is considered to be sexual harassment. Within our organization, this list of behavior is considered to be discrimination, right? And once you have that set out, it really ensures that you're responding to complaints about misconduct in a consistent, thorough, and fair fashion, because we all know that there's instances sometimes in organizations where a complaint from this person is received this way, but a complaint from this person is received another way. And then, that leads to employees really feeling like there's some issues around disparate treatment and maybe even bias. And that in and of itself, of course, can lead to liability from a legal perspective for an employer.
And you're not at all suggesting that sexual harassment is different, but that there's a nuance to how it's received
Exactly.
in
Exactly.
different places. So that sort of brings me to like the thing that's been gnawing at me that you and I have talked about that I really want leaders in corporate America to spend some time thinking about. And that is, I spent 30 years in corporate America, um, both being in the situation of having been discriminated against, hearing situations where others were discriminated against. Um, by the way, both sexual harassment as well as race discrimination.
Mhm.
And also sitting in the chair of being the leader, looking at cases that were brought forward, but that were very hard to corroborate,
Right.
right? Because we have moved from a very callous and overt system of racism to a very sophisticated and very subtle um, pattern sometimes
Right.
of racism. And I've sat in that chair where I've heard yeah, and here's what happened, but we could not find, here's what the employee says happened.
Right.
And here we were not able to find any corroborating evidence. But you know the person did what they did. Like you know it.
Right.
But even as a leader, there's not enough evidence to substantiate the case. So I am on this kick to find ways of strengthening the employee relations processes because I believe that because there's so much more subtle bias and subtle racism that we have to do something different
Yes.
in this space
Right.
because it's bugging me. It bugs me
Yeah.
that when Me Too happened and women were so open about the instances that happened to them, you saw the consequences happen to the people who inflicted the
Right.
discrimination.
Right.
But here we are, 5 months into this uprising around race, this unrest about race,
Mhm.
and you still have people who are uncomfortable sharing the situations that we sometimes go through, and you have not seen the consequences. So
Right.
I want to implore leaders to think about whenever there is a situation where the same individual has been accused of some sort of discriminatory or harassing behavior, that goes to an independent party like you.
Right.
And whether it's the third incident or the fourth incident or the fifth incident, but there should be no situation in corporate America where a single individual has been accused of harassment for half a dozen times, and
Right.
we can't figure out that there's a theme. So
Right.
let me pause there and let you react to all of that.
That is so wonderful and so insightful, and just a really interesting kind of snapshot of how these last few months have gone down, as opposed to the months that followed the inception of the Me Too movement. So what is interesting is this, and this is kind of, I'm going to nerd out for a minute. So there's becoming kind of this new class of misconduct, and organizations are realizing that they have to take a stand against it. So think about your typical HR, ER investigation involving misconduct. So previously the standard was, preponderance of the evidence. Is it more likely than not that this occurred? Um, and let's say it's not substantiated, right? Like you said, you gave that example where like you kind of know something happened, but maybe it
Yeah.
doesn't really rise to the legal level of preponderance of the evidence, not really sure what to do. So there's a new class of this is like a very like kind of layman's funny term that I've heard it called, which is there's substantiated allegations, which is you did the thing, you engaged in the discrimination. There's unsubstantiated, which could mean we either think you didn't do it or we're not sure. That we're not sure category requires some action. Does that make sense? So it can't be, it doesn't
Hmm.
meet the legal level for preponderance of the evidence. Therefore, there's nothing to see here. Go back to the office. You guys play nice in the sandbox. Because what's been so fascinating about the last several months, and I am a voracious New York Times reader. In the New York Times, I mean, it's been a steady drip ever since the murder of George Floyd, with really high profile organizations being in the press and having these really deep investigative articles written about discrimination and bias within those large and powerful organizations, right? And what I think is so interesting about that, if you read every single one of those articles in the New York Times, technically, I suppose that you could string those incidents and say, well, this was a series of microaggressions. I hate that word, but let's just say that that's what you're terming it, right? It still doesn't make a difference, right? A riddle that I tell my clients is how many microaggressions add up to an
Create an aggression. That's right.
right.
That's right. That's
Right.
right.
So, there was no footnote or caveat in these New York Times articles saying, to be fair, these were microaggressions. Who cares? right? And when you
Yeah.
look at all of those things in the aggregate and you're terming them microaggressions, you get so many of those, and now you have a workplace that's toxic and intolerable for Black people and people of color. So I think that a
Yeah.
lot of organizations are really starting to kind of reframe how they're categorizing incidents and what their response needs to be. So maybe, we don't feel that the misconduct rises to the level of being substantiated, but it still has to be addressed in some form.
Yeah, I really am bothered by the unsubstantiated. I think the unsubstantiated is significant.
Right.
And I think, I could look at my 33-year career, and there's a string of things that I know that I went through that I never reported any of them when they happened.
Right.
First of all, the early ones, it just wasn't the thing to do to report them,
Right.
right? The later ones, I just took them on myself, right?
Right.
but but I think that there's a whole swath of people who are stuck behind the string of unsubstantiated. And here's the example that I would give to you. So there was a time in my career, I'm not going to say which organization, I'm not going to say which business, but I was killing it. By the way, this has happened a couple of times, but this particular situation, um, I was killing it, right? In the same job, was doing very well, high profile assignment, and my boss changed.
Hmm.
And from the day my boss changed, and a lot of people are going to be nodding their heads because this is typical, right? You do well, someone else comes in, something happens. You haven't changed how you
Right.
behave, but how that person sees you. So my boss changed, and from the moment, day one, that person started in the new role, I was no longer as valued. My voice wasn't valued. I
Right.
didn't get the phone call. Couldn't look me in the eye. I
Hmm.
I had this regular meeting that I was a lead of, and um, I would make a suggestion, and it would get tossed aside.
Right.
And I've learned, which I think we also have to teach folk, is I learn very quickly, there's something different here that I got to put my finger on,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um, so I started experimenting to figure out like what I was doing differently versus what that person was seeing. And
Hmm.
I went on this little experiment to start to share some of the same ideas that I had put out in those meetings with others in the meeting. Um, of course, I was the only Black person in the meeting, all right.
Right.
And the same ideas would come out of the mouths of others, and they were good ideas
Right.
and exciting ideas.
Right.
So that actually made me realize very quickly there was no way I could be successful with that leader. So what did I do? I navigated myself to my next assignment. But
Right.
the number of times that I had to do that over a 33-year career is ridiculous, number one. Number two, um, the numbers of people who followed me
Right.
working for that same leader
Yeah.
who called me over a period of time to say, how did you actually navigate with this person? Because I can't seem to be successful. And my answer was, get the hell away. Right. But
Right.
like, I knew, like, how do you substantiate that this person doesn't see me, doesn't value me?
Right.
Right. For me to claim it was race would never have been corroborated by anyone other than the fact that I was the only one there. But there's a string over a career. There
Right.
has never been, to my knowledge, a Black person who has been successful with that manager.
Right.
And that's a problem for the people who are trying to navigate organizations, but it's also a problem for the organization
Right.
because that person was hugely successful over the years, but they've never developed a Black person in their career because nobody could put their finger on it. What's your reaction to that?
So I think that that's an excellent point. And I think we've all been in organizations where you see that cycle occur again and again and again. I think that forward thinking employers really have to be smart and thoughtful about their metrics and how they are tracking things. So that's, salary bands, promotions, turnover, complaints. Is it by team? Is it by location? Is it by manager? To the point that, at that organization, at some point, wouldn't it have been wonderful if someone had realized, Black people really don't seem to do well with this particular manager. We're up to 7 Black people now. I'm just making this up, right? And we keep on seeing people transferring out. There's got to be something there, right? That takes a lot of resources and a lot of time, but it requires, you keeping these statistics and figuring out how to turn it into something valuable that you can take actionable steps from. So I think that that's well received. And I think what's interesting about the point that you make is that's and I don't really want to use the term subtle, but that's one of those situations where like we all know what's going on, but
And we talk about it, right?
talk about it with each other, right? The organization may not, really have their finger on the pulse of that. But once again, that is the stuff that made up the New York Times articles all summer about this organization and this organization and this organization. And that's how it's showing up. Just an example of how racism and discrimination is showing up again and again and again. And I think that a lot of organizations are realizing they have to really get creative and strategic about targeting these problem spots. And I'm going to tell you something. When we do some accountability work for organizations, these are accountability audits. And that's basically just the doors are open. Who wants to talk? And we take that and we sift through those interviews and discussions that we're having with employees, and we start to identify problem areas, pain points, problematic managers, right? Problematic practices within the workplace. And I think that sometimes that's what it takes, right? So like the head of HR or ER or the COO or the general counsel thinks they have a grasp on what's going on with certain employees, and they really don't. And the only way that you can sometimes make that happen is by creating this very open space for people to have discussions, as opposed to making people come one by one and make a complaint to HR, just engaging in kind of a listening tour and really trying to put a point on what the issues are within your group.
In my experience is sometimes you need an outside organization to help you get there, right?
Right.
Just
Right.
by saying you want to create openness does not necessarily create openness, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you and I have spoken about this, but, the reluctance that a lot of employees feel to complain about something generally and to go to HR in the first place. They're scared about retaliation and their career trajectory and, a lot of different issues. But to create a 3-month space where you say, we've engaged with this third party organization, here is their email, here is their phone number. They'd love to jump on a call with you, meet with you, and let's just talk. Let's open up and figure out what the areas within our organization are that are really working and what really isn't.
So let's just maybe summarize some of the things that um, our listeners can go off and do. Number one is like my big pet peeve of recurring incidents, right?
Right.
So establish a threshold 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. I don't really care what it is. Look at perhaps the data and see like what's a nice cutoff point, right? That
Right.
your internal teams handle versus those that should go to an independent strategic partner.
Right.
And beyond 4 or 5 times, that independent third party, perhaps Triangle Investigations,
Right.
takes that um, work and does it independently. Because, by the way, most organizations, the employees feel that HR is working for HR.
Right.
So there are multiple reasons why you'd want to have an independent party doing um, the recurring matters. The accountability audit, I love that idea. Um, so, but what I like about what you describing is oftentimes when people talk about that, they're just looking at the culture. You're saying look at data as well to inform where there are problems in the organization, including ER. Anything else on that one?
Yeah, with respect to that, employers rather, excuse me, can get so granular with these statistics, right? So there's a particular organization that we're working with right now, and they have corporate employees and retail employees, locations all over the country, right? We are really digging into this with these people. So we are realizing this particular retail location has a lot of issues. And this particular team in corporate has a lot of issues. And once you can really target what your problem areas are, it really makes the path going forward to correct things much easier. At this point, anyone can start, right? So I say to some of my clients, before we kind of start digging into it, can you give me a year in review? So, like, I want you to go from today. So, let's go back to October 29th, 2019. And I want you to make a list of how many complaints you've received about misconduct. Is it more for discrimination? Is it more for sexual harassment? Where is it? Where is it coming from? And once we're armed with those stats, we can create the path to go forward.
You've also said in prior conversations with me that sometimes when you get a complaint about a specific individual and you ask the leaders on the other side, what do they know about the individual? Oftentimes they don't have the information.
Right,
So
right.
what should they be looking for there?
Well, everyone at this point should, especially, I was going to say especially large organizations, but that's not true. Small, mid, large, everyone needs to, invest as much as they can into a really good case management system. If you can't
Mm,
afford a case management system, go to Microsoft Excel, make yourself a little spreadsheet and start keeping your numbers and your statistics, because there are multiple organizations that will get called in for an investigation because something has happened. And, I'll say to the person who's hired me, the head of HR, the head of ER, tell me more about this person. Has there been complaints made against them in the past? When were they made? By whom? What was the outcome of the investigation, if any, that was conducted for those allegations? And almost, a lot of the times people are scrambling or they just don't know. Like, I got here a year ago. I don't really know this person. I'm not sure. Issues with turnover aside, just from a risk management and liability perspective, that's really not sufficient, right? You need to know who your problem actors are, or maybe you'll find out when you get a lawsuit filed against you in a year with 7 people saying this person has been doing this for the last 4 years. Why has it not been addressed? So, it really helps employers to be proactive and forward thinking and really focus on these metrics and these statistics, and having that information live in one place so that when a new head of ER does come in, they have that information as well, and that the information doesn't just disappear into a black hole.
Kia, my brain is on overload here. Just bear with me because I'm visualizing a continuum, right? And a continuum that leaders can look to say, how do we anticipate where there are issues?
Yeah.
And maybe there are indicators, and maybe, there's a number around turnover or attrition of women, pick it,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I feel like there's a case management system, but then perhaps maybe there's some analysis such that maybe it's not 4 incidents in a row necessarily by itself, but it's 4 incidents or 3 with greater than average female turnover or
Right.
something like that. How
Yeah.
does that give me a reaction to that? Because
I
I'll
think
be sleeping on that one all night.
there is no such thing as too much data. It doesn't exist, right? So you can get as granular as you like, what's the turnover level on this particular team? Who's leaving? Right? Why has every single woman and person of color that has been on this team not lasted more than a year? Right? And when, organizations really decide they want to start charting that out, it can make a huge difference with, creating the culture of the organization, maintaining the culture of the organization, and really engaging in appropriate corrective actions for employees that behave in a fashion that's inconsistent with what the organization wants.
And I just want to reiterate this point because I think it's really important. My belief is that careers are being stalled because of the lack of attention in this space,
Yes.
right? I want to broaden people's thinking around um, the issue of race and racism and the subtleties of it. It's embedded in all that we do, but I believe that companies are not even hearing I know that companies are not even hearing of much of what's happening because number one, I don't think the grievance systems are set up in as proactive a way as they can, given some of the things that we've said. But I also think people are reluctant to share because they don't believe that they will be corroborated, as is in the
Right.
case example that I gave you, right? So
Right.
I'm just on this mission to help people think about this issue of race grievances and the subtleties of it in as open a way as they are thinking about everything else in this, anti-racism environment,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I like that. You know what's fascinating, and this kind of just reminds me of this. So, some of our organizations, when we start walking through the app process, right? And this is how we're going to onboard your employees. But the app, here's your dashboard for you to monitor app submissions. So, we're going through that whole process. And we've had organizations say to us, what are we telling our organization members to report? Right. So, what are the boundaries of what they should and shouldn't be reporting? And generally, of course, we defer to the client, whatever they feel is best. But, don't you kind of want to know everything? Right. So, like, of course, I got groped at the holiday party or called a racial slur. Of course, that's what you want to know about. But what about the more subtle things? So, think about the example that you gave, Valerie. What if you'd been armed with an app that you know is being monitored by this third party expert investigations group? And you're saying, listen, I left this position with this person 3 years ago, but since then, 7 Black people have left. This is an issue, right? Why would an organization not want to know that, right? And I think that what's going on at this moment is social media is the world's loudest and biggest microphone, right? And the avenues by which employees can make complaints about grievances has completely changed from 5, 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
A lot of organizations have realized either we can do the work and learn about what the employee experience is like, keep our finger on the pulse of it constantly, or maybe we'll learn about it on social media or when we get a lawsuit or when there's a New York Times investigative article written about us. My example that I always love to use was several years ago with Uber, where a woman named Susan Fowler, who was an Uber engineer, wrote a random blog post about her year at Uber and detailed all the sexual harassment and discrimination that she suffered. That set
Hmm.
off a chain of events where the CEO of Uber was asked to resign by the board of directors, and Eric Holder, the former United States attorney, the attorney general, had to come in and do a full investigation. And that resulted from one blog post that went viral. And that was a domino effect that ended up with Attorney General Eric Holder having to come in and do a full investigation into Uber's practices and patterns of employee behavior and treatment. And I think that's such a warning, right? So I think that there's nothing too small or innocuous that organizations should feel like we don't really have time for that, because when you take things like that in the aggregate, you've got a really big problem.
Hmm. And Kia, do you find that people question you about having a code of conduct hotline versus the Tele app? Like, how do they think about those two things
So
distinctly?
I think so, my running joke about hotlines is you get told about a hotline your first day of a new job and then never hear about it again. So, you're a year, 2, 3 down the line, something happens. You're like, do I go to HR? Do I go to my manager? I remember somebody mentioning on a hotline, where's that number? Right. So it takes that guesswork out. What's
By
interesting
having the app on your phone.
at all, right.
So,
You're logging on with either your eye, your thumb, your biometrics, your 4-digit PIN code, whatever you like to use to access the system, and you're making the report super duper easy to use, and go ahead and get that complaint or that concern registered. What's interesting about Telly is that Telly was developed and launched last year, so pre-pandemic. Of course, not realizing that there was a pandemic around the corner, and that employers are going to be thrown, in different now in cities, different states, different countries, and misconduct is still occurring while employees are working remotely. So Telly has really given a lot of organizations a mechanism to know what's going on in Zoom rooms and phone calls and within teams, even when team members are located remotely.
you know what? That I'm so glad you said that because there would be those people that say, well, I don't really need that because no one's at work anymore. Um, but you gave an example once when we were talking about how one woman felt in a Zoom room. You want to give that example again, just to give
Yeah.
context to your
So we
comment?
have an investigation going right now that I say is like the perfect microcosm of this set of complaints. It is one of the Black female team members saying that her particular manager makes her turn her camera on for calls, but doesn't make the white colleagues turn their cameras on for Zoom calls, and that to her feels like an aggression and like excessive performance monitoring. And then there's another person on that team who very early on in the pandemic caught coronavirus and was very ill. And he said that his boss kept asking him, are you sick? Do you have coronavirus? Are you sick? Can you go back in the office? And he felt that that was
In front of everyone else?
No, this is one-on-one on phone calls and
Okay.
emails. But this person said, you know what? I felt like that was personal medical information. And what right does an employer
Mm,
have to know if you are sick or have been sick with coronavirus? That is a
mm.
fascinating question, by the way. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the case law doesn't exist. We're so new into this, but that's a very interesting, thought. And then additionally, and this is all in one investigation. I call this like my 2020 in a snapshot investigation. There's a team member on that team saying, we did some, online D&I training and we were supposed to talk about this being a safe space. And this one employee kept going on and on and on about how her father is a Trump supporter. And I felt, as a person of color, this is how that made me feel. And I feel like we weren't able to have a really good talk to unpack it. It just was like a heavy thing that like hung in the air, and it's really been bothering me. And what was she trying to say? And so that's like this 2020 investigation, right? Every single thing that I told you happened while people have been working remotely. They haven't been in the office together since March, so there's still things that are happening where
Yeah.
employees are being discriminated against remotely, and employers need to be cognizant of that and think through how are they finding out what's going on.
It's so fascinating every time I get to talk with you. There's so much that we have sort of dropped as nuggets, I think, for our listeners. Certainly the world is changing,
Yeah.
and conduct and grievances and leadership uh, matters. And a lot of what you talked about in those last three examples is about companies and culture,
Right.
right? I'm just grateful to have met you. I think you are a wonderful person who's incredibly brilliant. This
Thank you.
telly thing, I think, is the future of code of conduct, race relations, all of the above.
Right, right.
Um, Kia, how do people find you if they want to learn more about you or Triangle?
Absolutely. So you can go to our website to www.triangleinvestigations.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn. I love to message back. Just reach out to me. And thank you, Valerie, so much
Thank
for
you.
having me. I look up to you so much. You know that.
Aw,
You are so
thank you.
brilliant and just such a boss. And I love a chance to speak to you at any moment. I'm always here.
Thank you. So, how do you actually love to respond via LinkedIn with two babies and a business and a voracious New York Times reader? Like, how do you get all that done?
And a husband. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. I have learned, especially during the pandemic, to be very strategic with my time. So this amount of time is devoted to this amount of time is devoted to this, and you really have to stick to it. I find the line between work and home is disappearing slowly but surely, especially in this moment where so many of us are working from home. And I think that's why so many of us feel burnt out. It just feels like the days of working and cooking are just never ending. So I try to be really strategic about, protecting my time with my family and the time for myself, but then working really hard when necessary.
Good for you. I wish you all the best. If there's anything
So
I could do
much.
to help you be even more successful than you already are,
Thank
I just
you.
welcome the opportunity to do that. Thank you.
You're wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I
Thanks for joining.